In this video, I will run through all the settings that I use on my OM-1. I would recommend these for most if not all, especially as a starting point. If you're looking at settings, these are the ones you can look at. There are settings that require more explanation and detail, and I will get into those in upcoming videos. For now, let's look at all the settings. Let's start at the beginnings, since that is a good idea. This is the first page of the first camera menu. The custom mode I will get into later once we've gone through the settings. The raw format I've already covered in the earlier video, so I've already set this. And then there's the image review, which you might want to turn on or set to auto if you are new to the OM-1. This will review images but will not interfere with continuous shooting. The next setting is on page 2, the keep warm color, which we will want to set to off. This is very similar to the two auto modes for white balance on the Nikons. I prefer to keep it off instead of getting warm tones where not needed. This next option is on page 3, the upper limit in case you are using auto ISO. You might want to set it to a lower value to allow AI tools to recover better. The next option on the same page is low ISO processing. I have set it to detail priority because I would prefer details rather than a higher frame rate. You might need to set it to a different option depending on your use case. The last option here is noise reduction, which I set to off. In case you want noise reduction for your long exposure shots, you can set this on. It will double your shooting time because, for example, if you have a 30-second exposure, the camera will take another 30 seconds to figure out the noise reduction. The next option I change is on page 5, and this is metering during sequential shooting, which I set to off because in general the exposure will not change most of the time. The next setting that I change is on page 7, the anti-shock settings. I keep this on, and what this does is if the shutter speed is under 1/320th of a second, it will use the electronic shutter. Otherwise, the mechanical shutter is used. This will be active once you select the anti-shock in the drive mode. This last option on page 7, the silent shutter settings, is actually one of the most important ones because the OM-1 switches to this forcibly for bracketing modes. So make sure you have the settings correct in this one. Personally, I have set the noise reduction to off, the sound to off, the AF illuminator to off. Only the flash is allowed. Since I use the flash for bracketing, that is the only thing that I allow here. Although the waiting time here gives you an exposure delay, it only works in a select few bracketing modes. It works for focus bracketing, stacking, and HDR bracketing. It does not take all the shots automatically after the wait time for the other bracketing modes. Moving on to page 8, the image stabilizer. I have set this to IS priority rather than FPS because I prefer getting stabilized images rather than going in for a higher frame rate. Moving on to camera menu 2, I just set some limits in the focus stacking and for bracketing. The moment I switch to these, I do not want it to shoot endlessly. I set the defaults as per my needs, and you can also do the same based on your use cases. Moving on to the AF menu, the first option I enable is the manual focus in any AF mode. This can be very useful if you want to adjust focus even when using AF. This one is actually a major change for me. AF by half pressing the shutter release. I have been used to using the back button focus for years now, but given the weight and size of the OM-1, it is actually very simple to shoot at a full arm's length, and you do not want to use the back button focus for that, which is why after years of using the back button focus, I have enabled focus on half press of the shutter release. I have also set AF on enabled in the manual focus mode. This can be very useful for getting a quick focus on the subject before manually fine-tuning it. The next option I change is the shutter release priority. Just like in my earlier Nikons, I switch this off for both modes for the simple reason I do not want the camera to release the shutter unless it thinks it has something in focus. On page 2 of the AF menu, I set the AF illuminator to off, the AF area pointer to on 2. On 2 will display small square brackets where the focus is achieved, and it can be very helpful at times. The next setting that I change, and I have also discussed this in the previous video, is the MF clutch, and I generally set it to inoperative because I do not want to be surprised by the lens getting into the manual mode without my knowing. Moving on to the video menu, on page 2 I switch off the keep warm color just like I did for stills. On page 3 I set the noise filter to high because I'm mostly shooting at home in low light and it does help there. Moving on to the settings or gear menu, the first page I use the function lever settings and set that to mode 3. What this does is it allows me to switch to video just by switching the function lever. On page 2 I set the priority set to yes. What this does is by default wherever the camera asks you for an option, the default would be yes. A more specific example would be when you are formatting your SD card, the camera would default to yes rather than no, forcing you a few more steps to actually format the card. On page 4, I set the EVF style to style 3, which shows me the exact same thing that I would see on the LCD screen. On this page, I also set the info settings for stills and video to just 2 options. The check marks. A simple press of the info button switches me between a full screen image and all the settings. I will never lose out on the viewing area or get carried away by the other information on the LCD screen or the EVF. On page 5, I change the grid settings to use the preset 2, and then I change the color of preset 2 to a deep green, a full 255 of green with an alpha value of 100. Moving on to page 1 of the wrench menu. Although I did discuss the card slot settings in the previous video, I just wanted to point out the second option is primarily where the camera will store your videos. You might also want to check out the EVF adjust option on page 3. What this does is it turns the auto luminance off as required in the EVF. Having the auto luminance on could put your visual exposure off at times, and I prefer to switch it off. The moment you select this option by pressing the OK button, the LCD will go off and you will see the display only in the EVF, which is something similar to what you see on the screen, and you can adjust the settings by using the arrow keys around the OK button. Next is the setting for the beep on focus, which I prefer to keep off rather than disturb subjects. Now we go back to the gear menu for the button settings. This is where you can assign functions to the buttons on the camera body, and this can make a lot of features very accessible which would not be so otherwise. What you're seeing on the screen is the kind of settings that I have currently for my button settings. I will get into details of some of these settings, including my buttons, in an upcoming video. I have shared my settings file and the link to that is in the description. You can download the settings file and put them onto your own camera using the OI Share app or OM Workspace. And that's it for now. Have fun till the next one.